Zyra stood frozen, her glowing eyes locked onto the pulsating holographic display before her. The symbols on the screen shifted and pulsed with energy, confirming what her mind refused to accept. Pregnant. Her clawed fingers twitched involuntarily. Her twin hearts pounded, a rhythm out of sync with the steady hum of the medical chamber. Her entire body, genetically perfected through generations of selective breeding, had just been tainted. She bared her fangs. This is impossible. This is wrong. The medical drones floated silently around her, unaware of the storm brewing inside their queen's mind. The analytical data they projected remained unchanged. The pregnancy was progressing at an accelerated rate. The embryo was developing in ways that defied both logic and genetic law. The father's DNA matched that of a human. Zyra's breath came in sharp, controlled inhales. Her powerful frame, covered in iridescent scales that reflected the dim light, tensed as she stared at the incomprehensible data. A human. A weak, primitive, flesh-bound human. She snarled, stepping away from the display. The chamber's cold metallic floor vibrated slightly as she moved. Her mind raced through every possible scenario, every test, every scientific rule that should have made this a mere malfunction. Yet no error appeared. This was real. Her mind drifted back to the moment when everything changed. Weeks earlier, the human prisoner. The human Elias Carter was nothing special. He was an outlier among his kind, a scientist captured during a failed human reconnaissance mission near the borders of the Zyverian Dominion. His existence was meaningless. Yet, Zyra had chosen to personally interrogate him. Not because of fear. Not because of importance. But because he was different. Most humans, when captured, either groveled or displayed misplaced arrogance. Elias did neither. She had stood before him, towering over his seated form in the cold, sterile interrogation chamber. His species was frail, skin smooth and thin, eyes small but filled with something that unsettled her. He looked at her without fear. Even now, she recalled their first conversation with unnerving clarity. "You stare as if you've never seen a human before," Elias had said, tilting his head. Zyra had scoffed. "I have seen many humans. None of them were worth remembering." Elias smirked, leaning back in his restraints. "Yet here we are." Her claws had flexed instinctively. There was something in his voice, something undeniably dangerous. Not in the way warriors were dangerous, but in the way ideas could shatter entire empires. He was not afraid. He did not beg. He did not plead. He challenged. And for reasons she still could not understand, she had entertained that challenge. Days passed. Interrogations turned into conversations. Conversations turned into debates. And debates turned into something far more dangerous. Interest. Curiosity. Temptation. The night that changed everything. Zyra should have never let her guard down. The chamber had been dimly lit, the flickering glow of Zyverian fire orbs casting shifting shadows along the walls. Elias had stood, no longer bound, no longer a prisoner, but something else entirely. She had allowed him too close. She had let his words dig too deep. That night, the barrier between prey and predator, conqueror and captive, had shattered. She could still feel the warmth of his skin against her own, the foreign but intriguing sensation of human touch. She had dismissed it as a fleeting experiment, a moment of reckless curiosity. Something to be erased from memory. And yet, here she stood. Pregnant. With a hybrid. A new life growing inside her. Something no Zyverian queen had ever conceived before. The coming storm. Zyra's claws clenched into fists. She could not afford weakness. A child like this would bring chaos. Her rule would be questioned. The Galactic Council would demand an explanation. No. They would demand blood. The Xyverian dominion had ruled for millennia with an iron will. A queen bearing the offspring of a human would be seen as treason. She needed answers. She needed to fix this mistake. A sharp beep echoed through the chamber. One of the medical drones turned toward her, its synthetic voice hollow yet urgent. Priority transmission from the High Council. They demand an audience immediately. Zyra exhaled slowly. They knew. Her time was running out. But before she could respond, the chamber's doors slid open. A figure stood at the entrance. Elias Carter. His expression unreadable. His eyes locked onto hers. And in that moment, she realized something even more unsettling. He already knew. Zyra stood motionless, her twin hearts pounding against her ribcage as she locked eyes with Elias Carter. The human stood at the entrance of the medical chamber, his expression unreadable, but the weight of his gaze sent an unfamiliar sensation through her. He knew. The confirmation of her pregnancy was still fresh in her mind, the impossible reality that defied every Xyverian law and principle. Yet, Elias, a mere human, looked at her with something that unsettled her more than the data on the medical display. Understanding. How long have you known? Zyra's voice came out sharper than she intended. Elias took a step inside, the metallic floor cool beneath his bare feet. He wasn't wearing the restraints she had once forced upon him. That fact alone told him more than she intended. She hadn't seen him as a prisoner in a long time. Long enough, he said calmly, scanning the holographic medical readout floating above the diagnostic table. Zyra narrowed her eyes, studying him. She had spent years mastering the ability to read the body language of countless species. And yet, she could not decipher what was going on behind Elias Carter's piercing gaze. His shoulders remained relaxed. His breathing steady. No fear. No shock. He expected this. A slow realization crept over her. You did something to me. Elias let out a breath of amusement. If that were true, I don't think I'd still be alive. Her claws flexed involuntarily. He was right. If she had even suspected an attempt to tamper with her genetics, she would have torn him apart the moment she sensed it. Yet, here he stood. Whole. Unharmed. Unshaken. She turned away from him, exhaling. This is not possible. The genetic incompatibility should have made this an anomaly. An impossibility. Elias took another step forward, hands in his pockets. And yet, here we are. His words echoed their first conversation in the interrogation chamber. Here we are. She whirled back around. You speak as if you expected this outcome. Elias tilted his head. Not expected. But, understood it was a possibility. Her patience snapped. She crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat, her powerful form towering over him. Explain. He didn't flinch. Didn't step back. Elias Carter was either fearless or a fool. Genetics, he said simply, as if that single word answered everything. Her claws twitched. That is not an answer. Elias smiled, not in arrogance, not in defiance, but in a way that made her question everything she thought she knew. It's an answer you're not ready for yet. A challenge. Zyra inhaled sharply. She should have killed him right then and there, ripped his throat out for daring to toy with her like this. But something deep in her core stopped her. Not weakness. Instinct. Instead of attacking, she took a step back. Her mind worked quickly, dissecting his every word, his every movement. If he had suspected this was possible, if he truly understood something about their DNA that she didn't, then Elias Carter was far more dangerous than she had ever realized. And if she had figured that out, then so would the High Council. A sharp beep from the medical console reminded her of the transmission awaiting her response. The Xyverian High Council was calling. They knew. Her people had ruled with absolute genetic purity for millennia. A hybrid child, especially one with human DNA, was a declaration of war against their very nature. She turned back to Elias. I have to answer them. Elias's smirk faded. His expression grew serious. What will you tell them? She hesitated. The truth? A lie? She did not know yet. Instead of answering, she turned to the medical console and accepted the transmission. The High Council's verdict. The holographic projection of the High Council chamber materialized before her. 10 towering Xyverian figures stood in a semicircle, their ornate robes draped over their elongated, armored forms. Their leader, High Chancellor Varakes, stepped forward. His piercing, silver eyes locked onto her. Queen Zyra. You will explain yourself. Zyra straightened. She was no mere subordinate. She was a queen. And yet, she had never felt more like a cornered animal. What do you believe? I need to explain, Chancellor, she said, keeping her voice even. Varakes' eyes narrowed. Do not insult our intelligence. The other council members murmured in discontent. The medical reports have already reached us, Varakes continued. We know of the contamination growing inside you. Zyra felt Elias shift slightly behind her, but he remained silent. The genetic anomaly is under investigation, she said coolly. There is no evidence to suggest. Enough. Varakes' voice cut through the chamber like a blade. Do you take us for fools? A deep rumbling echoed through the council room. They were furious. Zyra's claws twitched at her sides. What do you want, then? Varakes took a step forward, his next words sending a chill down her spine. The offspring will be terminated. Zyra's twin hearts stopped. You will submit yourself to immediate genetic purification. You will eliminate this aberration, and you will never speak of this disgrace again. Silence hung in the air. Zyra clenched her jaw. Something inside her twisted. Rage? Fear? She did not know. But she did know one thing. The idea of erasing the life growing inside her felt wrong. Unnatural. For the first time in her life, she hesitated before obeying an order from the High Council. And they saw it. You hesitate, Varakes said, his voice dark with warning. Do not make the mistake of believing you have a choice, Queen Zyra. Her claws tightened. She should have agreed. Should have submitted. But when she turned her gaze slightly, she caught sight of Elias. He was watching her. Waiting. And for reasons she could not explain. She refused to back down. The child is under my protection, she said before she could stop herself. The entire council chamber erupted into chaos. You dare? This is an act of treason. You defile the purity of the Xyverian line. Varakes' voice boomed above the others. If you refuse to cleanse this taint, then we have no choice. His expression turned cold. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your title as queen. Your status as ruler is revoked. Zyra inhaled sharply. She had just lost everything. And in that moment, she understood the full weight of her decision. There was no going back. The transmission cut off, leaving only silence. Zyra turned to Elias. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. But then he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. And she realized. He had been waiting for this all along. Zyra stood frozen, staring at the darkened holoscreen where the High Council's furious voices had echoed just moments ago. The weight of their words pressed against her chest. Stripped of her title. Branded as a traitor. Hunted. Her entire life, her rule, her status, her people, gone. Behind her, Elias Carter exhaled through his nose, his arms crossed as he leaned casually against the medical console. His expression was unreadable, but the sharpness in his eyes told her that he had expected this outcome. "You seem calm," she said, forcing her voice to remain even. Elias shrugged. "Because I knew this would happen." Her claws flexed. "You knew, and yet you said nothing?" "You wouldn't have listened," he replied, tilting his head slightly. "But now you see the truth. They were never going to accept what's inside you." Zyra's twin hearts pounded at the reminder. The child growing within her, the impossible hybrid, was now the single greatest threat to the Zyverian way of life. And for the first time in her existence, so was she. The sharp whine of an alarm filled the chamber. The lights flickered to a deep red. Her head snapped toward the main control panel. A flashing alert scrolled across the screen. "Security override engaged. Royal Guard inbound." She stiffened. They were coming for her. Zyra turned sharply to Elias. "Move." He didn't hesitate. As she sprinted toward the exit, Elias was already by her side, keeping pace with a speed she hadn't expected from a human. The corridor beyond the medical chamber was eerily silent, but Zyra knew better. The Zyverian High Guard, her High Guard, would be in pursuit. "They'll cut us off at the docking bay," she said. "We need another exit." Elias gave her a look that made it clear he had already considered that. "I have an idea." She frowned but didn't question him. "Not now." They turned down a maintenance corridor, the sleek metallic walls humming with the ship's energy. Elias grabbed a panel near the floor, yanking it open. Zyra hesitated. "Event system? That's your plan?" Elias smirked. "Unless you have a better one, Your Majesty." She bristled at the title, one she no longer held. Without another word, she slipped into the tight space. The cold metal pressed against her skin as she maneuvered through the narrow shaft. Elias followed, sealing the panel behind them. The alarms blared louder now. The distant sound of marching footsteps echoed through the corridor. They were running out of time. The betrayal. The vent led them to the lower decks, where the ship's power core thrummed with contained energy. Zyra moved quickly, her mind racing through every possible route of escape. They needed a ship. A fast one. She turned to Elias. "Your idea, what is it?" He motioned toward a control terminal in the corner. "I can override the lockdown protocols. Get us access to an unmanned transport vessel." Zyra narrowed her eyes. "You can do that?" Elias grinned. "You'd be surprised what humans can do when they have the right motivation." She didn't trust him. Not fully. But right now, he was her only option. As Elias worked at the console, Zyra paced, her claws tapping against her palm. The silence of the lower decks was unnerving. Too quiet. Something felt wrong. Then she heard it, the soft click of a weapon charging behind her. She spun, her heart slamming against her ribs. Standing at the entrance of the chamber was Commander Sareth. Zyra's breath caught. Sareth had been her most loyal officer. Her closest advisor. And now, he was aiming a Zyverian plasma rifle at her head. Her throat tightened. Sareth. His silver eyes were cold. Empty. "You should not have defied them, Zyra." She flinched at the absence of her title. "They ordered you to kill it," Sareth continued, his grip tightening on the weapon. "And now you're a traitor." Zyra's claws twitched. "I had no choice." "There is always a choice," Sareth said. "You chose wrong." A slow rage burned in her chest. Elias stepped forward, his hands raised. "I don't suppose we can talk this through?" Sareth's lip curled. "Stay out of this, human." You're the reason she fell this far. Elias sighed. That's a no, then. The tension in the room thickened. Zyra locked eyes with Sereth. Are you here to kill me? His silence was the only answer she needed. Her muscles coiled. She had trained Sereth. She knew his weaknesses. She also knew she only had one chance. Then, in a blur of motion, she lunged. Sereth fired. The plasma bolt seared past her, barely missing her shoulder. Zyra slammed into him, her claws locking around his wrist. The rifle clattered to the ground. Elias moved fast, kicking the weapon across the room. Sereth struggled, his strength nearly matching hers, but Zyra had something he didn't, a reason to fight. She twisted sharply. Crack. Sereth gasped as she dislocated his shoulder, dropping him to his knees. He looked up at her, eyes filled with something close to regret. You can't outrun them, Zyra. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she grabbed Elias's arm. We're leaving. Sereth didn't stop her. He only watched as they disappeared through the exit hatch. The Great Escape. The docking bay was swarming with guards. Zyverian soldiers lined the walkways, their weapons primed. Zyra's breath quickened. They couldn't fight their way through this. Elias nudged her. Look up. She followed his gaze to a maintenance scaffolding overhead. A decommissioned stealth-class cruiser rested there, small, fast, and unguarded. Hope flickered in her chest. Elias grinned. Think you can fly that thing? Zyra smirked. Watch me. They climbed up the scaffolding undetected. The cruiser's access hatch was unlocked, a miracle, or maybe just a sign of Elias's uncanny luck. The moment they slipped inside, Zyra powered up the engines. The ship hummed beneath her hands. Then. Alarms. Yeah, they definitely noticed us, Elias muttered. Zyra clenched her jaw. The docking bay doors were sealing shut. If they didn't move now. Hold on. She slammed the thrusters. The cruiser lurched forward, skimming the edge of the closing doors. Plasma fire streaked past them as Zyverian ships launched in pursuit. The moment they hit open space, Elias whooped. We're alive. Zyra shot him a glare. For now. Because this was far from over. The Zyverian Dominion wouldn't stop hunting them. They would never stop. But as she glanced at Elias, something inside her shifted. For the first time, she wasn't alone. And for the first time, she had something worth fighting for. The stolen stealth-class cruiser drifted through the void of space, cloaked in darkness. Its engines purred softly, running on low power to avoid detection. Zyra sat in the cockpit, her hands gripping the controls. Every breath felt heavy. Every thought was a battlefield. She had lost everything. Her throne. Her people. Her name. And now, the Zyverian Dominion hunted her like a criminal. But none of it compared to the storm brewing inside her. She turned her gaze toward Elias Carter. The human sat on the co-pilot's chair, his arms behind his head, feet resting on the dashboard like he had no care in the world. His easy demeanor infuriated her. She clenched her jaw. You knew. Elias cracked one eye open. Knew what? Her claws dug into the seat's leather. That the Zyverian High Council would turn against me. That they would brand me a traitor. That they would try to kill my child. Elias sighed, lowering his feet. Yeah. I knew. Rage burned in her veins. She shot up from her seat. And you didn't think to warn me? Elias met her glare without flinching. Would you have listened? Her lips parted, but no words came. Because he was right. She had been so sure of her authority. So sure that her people would never turn on her. Elias had seen the truth long before she had. And that truth had nearly gotten her killed. Her fists trembled. "You should have told me anyway." Elias shrugged. "Wouldn't have changed the outcome." She hated that he was right. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Zyra exhaled and dropped back into her seat. Her eyes flickered to the navigation screen. They were still drifting through uncharted space, avoiding Zyverian patrols. But that wouldn't last forever. "We need a plan," she muttered. Elias nodded. "Agreed." Zyra hesitated before speaking again. "I need to know something first." Elias raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." She ignored him. "How do you know so much about the Zyverian Dominion? You're a human. You shouldn't have had access to our political workings, let alone our deepest secrets." Elias's expression didn't change. But something in his eyes shifted. Zyra narrowed her gaze. "You're hiding something." Elias exhaled, rubbing his temples. "All right. You caught me. I know more than I let on." Zyra leaned forward. "Explain." He studied her for a moment. Then, finally, he said, "I used to work for them." Silence. Zyra blinked. "For who?" Elias gave her a small, grim smile. "The Zyverian Dominion." A chill ran through her spine. "That's impossible." Elias stretched his arms. "Not really." Zyra's mind raced. The Zyverian Dominion never allowed outsiders into their inner workings. The very idea of a human, one of the so-called inferior species, being employed by them was absurd. And yet, her instincts told her Elias wasn't lying. "Start talking," she demanded. Elias nodded. "All right. But you won't like it." The human spy. Elias leaned back, his voice calm but firm. "Years ago, I was taken from Earth." Zyra's breath hitched. "What?" Elias smirked. "Surprised? Your people have been abducting humans for a long time. I was just one of the unlucky ones." Her stomach twisted. She knew about the covert experiments. Zyverian scientists had been collecting data on humans for centuries, but most subjects didn't survive. Yet Elias had. She frowned. "How did you end up working for them?" Elias exhaled. "At first, I was just a test subject. They wanted to see how humans reacted to different conditions, gravity shifts, neurological stimulations, genetic compatibility." His gaze flickered toward her stomach. Zyra stiffened. Genetic compatibility. The meaning was clear. "They experimented on you," she murmured. Elias chuckled bitterly. "Yeah. But I adapted faster than they expected. I learned how their systems worked. Their language. Their protocols. Eventually, I convinced them I was useful." Zyra couldn't believe what she was hearing. A human spy. Embedded within the Zyverian Dominion. No wonder Elias knew so much. But one question burned in her mind. "Why didn't they kill you?" Elias's smirk faded. "They tried." His voice was quiet now. Dark. Zyra felt an unfamiliar sensation, pity. Elias had survived the impossible. He had lived among her people, played their game, and walked away. And now, he was on the run with her. She inhaled sharply. "What's your real plan, Elias?" His lips curled into a grin. "Same as yours. Survive." Zyra's eyes narrowed. She didn't fully trust him. But she didn't have to. Right now, he was her best chance. The final revelation. The ship's warning system suddenly blared. Zyra snapped her head toward the control panel. An incoming transmission. Her stomach turned cold. Only one entity had the ability to override their stealth mode. The Zyverian High Council. A cold, emotionless voice filled the cockpit. Former Queen Zyra of the Zyverian Dominion. You are ordered to surrender immediately. Elias sighed. They're persistent. Zyra's pulse pounded. They had found her. The voice continued. We know about the child. Zyra froze. The transmission crackled. It is not just a threat to us. It is a threat to the entire galaxy. Elias leaned forward. What the hell does that mean? The voice pressed on. Do you truly think we would allow such an abomination to exist? A chill spread through Zyra's body. She had assumed they wanted her child dead because of the political implications. But now, she wasn't so sure. Something much bigger was at play. Elias exhaled. Okay, I don't like where this is going. Zyra swallowed hard. Neither do I. Then, the transmission ended. A new alert flashed on the screen. Elias read it aloud. Oh, that's bad. Zyra's claws tightened. What? Elias turned to her, his expression grim. They're sending an assassin. Cliffhanger, the Zyverian Dominion isn't just hunting Zyra, they fear her child for a reason she doesn't yet understand. An elite assassin has been sent to kill them both. The truth about the child's power remains unknown. And Elias's past may be even darker than he admits. Deep space, uncharted territory. The stolen cruiser hurtled through the void, its engines pushing against the impossible odds. Zyra gripped the controls, her breathing shallow. Her mind raced. They had sent an assassin. Not a squad. Not a fleet. One. Single. Operative. That meant only one thing. They didn't expect to need more. Elias was already working at the ship's console, hands moving with practiced efficiency. The man had been too calm since the transmission. Too composed. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust him. But she needed him. We have to move faster, she said, eyes flicking to the proximity scanner. They wouldn't have sent someone unless they were already close. Elias didn't look up. We're in deep space. They don't know our exact location. Zyra hissed. Then why am I getting a alert, unidentified ship approaching? The words blinked across the holographic display. Elias muttered a curse. Zyra's claws dug into the console. How long until they reach us? Elias tapped the screen, calculating. Not long. She exhaled sharply. Weapon status? Elias shot her a flat look. We're in a stolen civilian-class cruiser. We don't have weapons. Zyra stiffened. No defenses. Minimal shielding. Elias ran a hand through his hair. We're sitting ducks. Her heartbeat pounded. The Zyverian Dominion didn't take risks. If they sent an assassin, it was already over. Unless. We need to lose them, she said. Now. Elias grinned. Already ahead of you. Before she could react, he slammed a button. The ship lurched. A deep hum filled the cockpit as the jump drive activated. The stars outside blurred. Then. Darkness. Zyra gasped. What did you just do? Elias leaned back. Warped into a nebula. Zyra's stomach twisted. That's crazy. Elias smirked. Yeah. But it's better than waiting to die. Zyra's talons curled. The nebula's energy fields would jam all tracking systems. It was a smart move, if they survived. She glared at him. And what if we crash into something? Elias shrugged. Then we die. Her claws clenched into fists. I hate you. Elias grinned. You'll thank me later. She had no response to that. Because deep down, she wasn't sure he was wrong. The assassin has already arrived. The nebula churned around them, deep purples and electric blues swirling like a cosmic storm. Zyra watched the scanners. No sign of pursuit. Maybe they had. A cold presence prickled at the edge of her senses. Her blood turned to ice. No, she whispered. Elias frowned. What? She turned slowly. He's already here. Elias stiffened. That's not funny. Her claws flexed. I'm not joking. Elias cursed under his breath. How? Zyra's chest tightened. She knew exactly how. The assassin hadn't been following them. He had been waiting. A chilling hiss echoed through the ship's corridors. Zyra's breath caught. Elias grabbed a blaster from under the console. I thought you said Zyverians don't use assassins. They don't, she whispered. Elias's grip tightened. Then who the hell did they send? A shadow flickered at the cockpit's entrance. Zyra's heart stopped. The figure stood tall, clad in obsidian armor. The air around him shimmered, warping unnaturally. Not Zyverian. Not human. Something else. Something far worse. Elias took a slow step back. That's not normal. Zyra's claws extended. Run. The assassin moved. Faster than sight. Zyra barely had time to react before Elias was slammed into the wall. The human gasped, eyes wide in shock. Zyra lunged. A single blow sent her crashing into the control panel. Sparks flew. Pain exploded through her ribs. The assassin loomed over her. His face was hidden behind an emotionless mask. But she could feel the hatred radiating off him. You should not exist, he said. His voice was cold. Wrong. Zyra's vision blurred. The ship trembled. She forced herself to move. But the assassin raised a hand. And Zyra's body locked in place. Paralysis. Some kind of technology? A psychic attack? She didn't know. All she knew was she was about to die. Elias fights back. The assassin raised a blade, black as the void. Zyra couldn't move. Couldn't fight. But Elias could. With a snarl, the human lifted his blaster. And fired point-blank into the assassin's chest. A flash of light. A shockwave. The assassin was thrown backward. The paralysis broke. Zyra gasped, her body collapsing. Elias grabbed her wrist. Move. No hesitation. Zyra ran. The escape plan. Elias dragged her down the corridor. The assassin's footsteps echoed behind them. Zyra's mind raced. They couldn't outrun him. They had to be smarter. The engine room. Zyra yanked Elias toward the door. In here. Elias barely kept up. What's the plan? She slammed the controls. The door sealed shut. Elias exhaled. Okay, great. We're trapped now. Zyra ignored him. She sprinted to the reactor core. She tapped commands into the console. Elias's eyes widened. Wait, are you? Zyra's voice was calm. I'm venting the nebula gas into the ship. Elias paled. That'll explode, she finished. He stared at her. That's insane. The door shuddered. The assassin was already breaking through. Zyra met Elias's eyes. Got a better idea? A pause. Then. Elias grinned. Let's blow this place up. Zyra slammed the final command. The ship's AI blared a warning. Critical failure, core overload imminent. Elias grabbed her hand. Escape pod? She nodded. They ran. The explosion. They barely made it. The escape pod launched just as the ship detonated. A shockwave ripped through the nebula. The assassin's ship was caught in the blast. Engulfed in fire. Then. Silence. Only the escape pod remained, drifting through the wreckage. Zyra gasped for breath. Elias let out a shaky laugh. Well, that was awful. Zyra didn't respond. She was staring at the burning debris. And the figure floating in space. Elias fights back. The assassin raised a blade, black as the void. Zyra couldn't move. Couldn't fight. But Elias could. With a snarl, the human lifted his blaster. And fired point-blank into the assassin's chest. A flash of light. A shockwave. The assassin was thrown backward. The paralysis broke. Zyra gasped, her body collapsing. Elias grabbed her wrist. Move. No hesitation. Zyra ran. The escape plan. Elias dragged her down the corridor. The assassin's footsteps echoed behind them. Zyra's mind raced. They couldn't outrun him. They had to be smarter. The engine room. Zyra yanked Elias toward the door. In here. Elias barely kept up. What's the plan? She slammed the controls. The door sealed shut. Elias exhaled. Okay, great. We're trapped now. Zyra ignored him. She sprinted to the reactor core. She tapped commands into the console. Elias's eyes widened. Wait, are you? Zyra's voice was calm. I'm venting the nebula gas into the ship. Elias paled. That'll explode, she finished. He stared at her. That's insane. The door shuddered. The assassin was already breaking through. Zyra met Elias's eyes. Got a better idea? A pause. Then. Elias grinned. Let's blow this place up. Zyra slammed the final command. The ship's AI blared a warning. Critical failure, core overload imminent. Elias grabbed her hand. Escape pod? She nodded. They ran. The explosion. They barely made it. The escape pod launched just as the ship detonated. A shockwave ripped through the nebula. The assassin's ship was caught in the blast. Engulfed in fire. Then. Silence. Only the escape pod remained, drifting through the wreckage. Zyra gasped for breath. Elias let out a shaky laugh. Well, that was awful. Zyra didn't respond. She was staring at the burning debris. And the figure floating in space. Unaffected. The assassin had survived. Zyra's blood ran cold. Elias exhaled. Oh, come on. Then. The assassin turned his head. And they knew. He wasn't finished yet. Drifting in the aftermath. The escape pod floated through the wreckage of their destroyed ship. Fires flickered in the distance, remnants of the explosion still burning in the vacuum of space. Zyra's heart pounded. The assassin had survived. He floated amid the debris, untouched by the destruction. His black armor shimmered, distorting the space around him. He turned his head toward them, and Zyra felt a chilling certainty. He was coming. Elias muttered, I really hate that guy. Zyra ignored him. She scanned the pod's control panel. Limited fuel. No weapons. Nowhere to run. Their only option was to fight. She turned to Elias. You have a plan? He gave her a sideways glance. I was kind of hoping you did. Her jaw tightened. We don't have time for jokes. Elias exhaled. Fine. We can't outrun him. We need to lure him somewhere. Zyra narrowed her eyes. Somewhere dangerous. Elias smirked. Exactly. Zyra's claws tapped against the console. Then. Her eyes widened. There. Elias leaned forward. What am I looking at? A dead star. A collapsed, dying remnant of a sun. A gravitational death trap. Elias whistled. That's ambitious. Zyra's gaze hardened. It's our only chance. The assassin attacks. Before Elias could respond, the pod shook violently. The assassin had reached them. Zyra barely had time to brace before the walls buckled. The metal twisted as an invisible force gripped the pod. Then. Rip. A hole tore open. Air rushed out into the vacuum. Zyra's claws latched onto the seat. Elias grabbed a safety strap, holding on for dear life. And then. The assassin stepped inside. Unaffected by the vacuum. Unbothered by physics. He walked toward them as if gravity still existed. Zyra's heart raced. Elias pulled his blaster. The assassin vanished. Then. Reappeared behind Elias. Zyra gasped. Elias. But it was too late. The assassin gripped Elias's throat. Elias choked, his blaster clattering to the floor. The assassin turned to Zyra, his voice like grinding metal. You carry something that should not exist. His gaze flickered to her stomach. Zyra's breath caught. She understood now. It wasn't just her they wanted dead. It was her child. Something inside her snapped. She lunged. The assassin raised his other hand. Zyra dodged. She wasn't fast enough. His strike clipped her ribs. Pain exploded through her body. But she used the momentum. She grabbed Elias's fallen blaster. And fired point-blank into the assassin's helmet. The energy bolt flashed. The assassin staggered. For the first time. Elias coughed, gasping for air. Zyra didn't hesitate. She grabbed him and slammed the emergency thrusters. The pod rocketed forward, straight toward the dead star. The dead star's wrath. Gravity pulled at them instantly. The assassin recovered. His mask was cracked where Zyra had shot him, revealing dark, metallic flesh underneath. He snarled. Zyra's claws dug into the controls. The dead star's gravity well was too strong. If they didn't escape now, they'd be crushed. But if the assassin stayed on board. He reached for Elias again. Zyra made a choice. She slammed a button. The airlock opened. A violent force ripped through the pod. Zyra held onto Elias. But the assassin was sucked into space. For the first time, he lost control. He flipped end over end, spiraling toward the dead star. Gravity grabbed him. He vanished into the abyss. Elias gasped. Is he? Zyra exhaled. Gone. The ship shuddered. Their pod was still being pulled in. Zyra's claws flew over the controls. Come on, come on. Elias pressed buttons at random. Do something. Zyra snarled. I'm trying. The engines roared. The pod jerked violently. And then. They broke free. The dead star shrank behind them. Zyra collapsed in her seat. Elias laughed breathlessly. Remind me to never take a vacation with you. Zyra gave him a look. Then she smirked. The truth about her child. Hours later, they drifted in the quiet of space. Zyra stared at the vast nothingness, lost in thought. Elias nudged her. You okay? She hesitated. Then, they weren't just after me. Elias frowned. What do you mean? Zyra placed a clawed hand on her stomach. Elias's eyes widened. They were after the baby. His expression darkened. Why? She exhaled. I don't know. But she had a feeling. Something about this child scared the Zyverian Dominion. More than war. More than rebellion. Something greater. Elias leaned back. Well, whatever it is, I guess we'll find out. Zyra looked at him. She thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal. The escape. The assassin. She had spent her life hating humans. And yet, here he was. A human who had saved her life. Maybe. Just maybe. This child wasn't something to be feared. Maybe it was hope. Zyra looked at the stars. Whatever came next. She was ready. The end, or a new beginning. Zyra and Elias survived. The assassin is gone, for now. But the Zyverian Dominion won't stop hunting them. Because Zyra's child isn't just an accident. It's something the galaxy has never seen before. And one day, it will change everything.